I will give you the quick intro, say, hey everybody, welcome to the afternoon of the Zero Carbon Retreat. And what we have here is a treat for you. This is a discussion of heat waves. It's wintertime. We don't actually have to deal with that yet. That's about an hour from now when we go deep into cold waves or peak, climate extreme events of the winter. So, but Tom, who is a nationally recognized expert, who, if you email with him, beware, he will send you back at least 8 links per email. And it just always has a tremendous amount of information, unchallenged, the expert on this topic in my experience. So congratulations, you guys are about to go deep into this issue of what it's like for the world to get warmer and how we can build now to prepare for the world that we created back in the 70s. Like we've already got a whole bunch of climate change in front of us it's a done deal. So we just need to be wise and prepare and be flexible, right? And be real, like engage. So thank you, Tom and Emily, for your deep insights you'll provide, and away you go.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Thank you for inviting me to work with you and Emily on this very hot and critical topic. And yes, I am kind of an information junkie, but I think it was from training and working at state agencies where you had to do due diligence and CYA and make sure you could back up whatever you said. In any case, yeah, we're here to give you some of our new exploratory results and proof of concept on how to assess overheating risks, in this case in a single family building. And of course, ideally we'd be building multifamily buildings that are even more efficient and so on, but this is a multifamily building. And I'm not sure how to get to my next, there we go. So why do we say new abnormals? Because things are constantly changing now in our global and local environments. We've shifted the whole temperature distribution curve way to the right. And so what used to be normal was fairly comfortable and safe, and now it's shifted to way over to the extreme heat, where we're getting into that 3 standard deviation range, which is pretty nasty stuff. Basically, we're going to cover why we need to address this issue and go into the background of some of the heat health risks and indoor exposure issues and importance, and then cover study objectives, the methods, and results, and talk a little bit about research and emerging trends. I haven't had a chance to really kind of flesh out this presentation on this. I've been busy with some surgery recovery, but we can talk about it and follow up later, and then try to wrap up with some summary, conclusions, and recommendations. Just a quick question I like to ask people. How many of you are over 65? I am. How many of you know somebody that's over 65? How do you know anybody that will eventually be over 65? So that's just one example of a vulnerable population in terms of heat exposures, but there's a lot of other groups too that we can talk about. But the major issue is that heat and humidity can kill. When you start elevating the body temperature, your organ systems shut down and you can go over the edge real quickly. So then you need to start soaking people in cold or ice water bath and somehow do rapid cooling, and don't wait for 911. And here's an example. This has really got my attention, why I kind of got into this back around 2010. I had been dabbling in environmental review stuff on climate change back in the 80s and on into the 90s, and focused on indoor environmental quality. But when I retired and I looked at a lot of the building indoor health and exposure data, I realized that one of the most common complaints was really about thermal comfort, overheating and underheating, and sometimes noise in homes and commercial buildings and schools and so on. And this study was funded by CARB, and they found that by looking at future climate projections to the end of the century using what they call climate systems or weather systems, they projected around 5 to 9,000 deaths per year. That's about a tenfold increase over the current rate of about 650. Not, I mean, that was a heat wave. I'm sorry. But they were just looking at urban metro areas and just seniors. So if you think about all the other populations involved, now this was, of course, no adaptation, but even if you cut that in half, that was a lot compared to the historical average of about 165 deaths per year. Down in LA, you can see an example of medium population growth on the right and no population growth on the right. So somewhere, even at 700 deaths per year, that's still an awful lot, because those are deaths that are diagnosed by the coroner. Those are real deaths, not theoretical cancer risk deaths or anything. So we've seen more and more heat waves, more and more bigger and worse power outages back, in the 2006 heat wave and even before that. And we know that the grid is getting really stressed from not only these peak power demands, but also the heat itself actually reduces the efficiency of the whole generation and transmission system. And now we're killing off shade trees and vegetation, and we're having more fires, and we're becoming prisoners in our own homes because of the heat and the smoke and so on. So why is indoor heat exposure so important? Well, we know it's a big mortality and morbidity or disease and productivity problem. Most of the long-term exposures indoors, we spend over 90% indoors, especially for vulnerable persons like the elderly and children and chronic disease patients. We're finding out that even moderate heat increases health risks. When you look at some of the dose response curves from outdoor heat, at least, you can see that there's things start kicking in around the 22C level, not at what some of the occupational health standards are like, but say 28C.
Can you give that in Fahrenheit?
No.
Oh. Where do you live? What country are you in?
I have only been to Europe a few times. I'm sorry. I have to do a conversion, but we'll use Fahrenheit later.
Okay.
But I guess what I'm saying is that it's cooler than you think. It's only moderate temperatures, like the 80s probably, because the 30s would be up in the 90s. 40s are way over 100. Okay, so the other thing that I can show you if you're interested is that these health responses are not linear. For some of these things like, say, kidney disease patients, once they hit that, say, 22C degrees, the curve just goes almost straight up, and they have like a 30-fold increase. It's pretty scary. And like I said, when you actually look at the thermal data from buildings, we've found out that a lot of the new California homes are often too hot, and part of that is just poor installation, but part of it is just that the buildings aren't really designed very well. The other thing that's raising the importance of indoor heat exposure, or awareness, I should say, is that there's a lot of new data coming out from Harvard and other places about even moderate heat exposures on student and worker performance and how significant that is. And that adds up to a lot of dollars and economic impacts as well. And then last but not least, lawsuits are on the rise in terms of overheating of residential buildings and care facilities. And so there's really a due diligence issue there. Let's see, some of the climate change impacts or exacerbations on health risks include, as we mentioned, extreme heat. The heat waves are getting more frequent, more intense, and longer, and then drought is also creating a feedback cycle and exacerbating that. Nighttime temperatures and heat are increasing faster than daytime temperatures, and that's affecting sleep deprivation, which has a big health effect we're finding out, especially for, say, elderly people. And then we're also finding that humidity is a growing problem to exacerbate heat exposures. And then a lot of other things that we know about and are growing in importance, like wildfires and urban heat islands, are going to be exacerbated, and power outages, which I can touch on a little. And the reason why indoor exposure is so important is that buildings are shelter from the elements. That's the basic function of it. And if they're not providing that shelter, then we either need to fix that shelter or find another shelter. And unfortunately, the heat health warning systems that and cooling centers and so on haven't been all that effective so far. They're only limited effective, especially say in a rural area or for vulnerable populations that aren't very mobile. I don't know what that is. Oh, I went to the end. Sorry. Um, so here's just a quick framework. We have the climate on the left affecting the environment, what we're exposed to, and for example, hazards from extreme heat and air pollution. And then on the top, the vulnerability, how sensitive are we to that and how much can we adapt? And on the bottom is what are we actually exposed to indoors and outdoors in terms of heat and air quality and other things that affect us. And so the overlap is the kind of the net health risk that's going to show up in the hospitals and in your productivity and so on. And all of these things are affected by the building practices, energy systems, and sociodemographics, which are what we're kind of trying to address in this this project. Okay. So we basically have a climate emergency. The future's now. We need to address these regions. I mean, these issues, and some regions are going to be hit sooner than the others. We're starting to see marine heat waves increase globally, and that's, to me, that's almost like a big tipping point, because not only is there huge ecosystem and food shortage damage, but the oceans have, in recent studies, look like they may be soon running out of capacity to absorb the CO2. So then it'll just go right into the environment and accelerate the heating. And sometimes, you know, we get asked, well, why is California, the U.S., why do we need to address this big problems overseas? No, we need to lead the way. So we all have to pay our fair share that we've accumulated over the years too. You may have seen this. This last year was the second warmest year on record. Past 5 years were the warmest of the past 140 years. It may have seemed relatively mild this year, but when you look at the northern latitudes, that's that all has a kind of trickle down effect literally on the rest of the world. This 2018 was really bad. We had record heat waves in Southern California. And part of that was due to a big marine heat wave off the coast where the temperatures were almost like Hawaii. They were about 75 to 76 degrees, and it kept humidity high as well. So we had an early heat wave in late June. We had thousands and thousands of people without power, record power demand, and another record broken. So latest news is this next decade is going to be even worse. And ocean heating is in terms of the basic physics, is the big elephant in the room, because that's our big reservoir. But now, since about 2000, the net heat content has been going mainly into the ocean in the terms of equivalent to about 5 atomic bombs every second. So that's just mind-boggling, I think. So yes, we have a climate emergency. People are expected to be affected drastically. There's an estimate for the US for heat and cold in 49 cities with no adaptation. And the risks are estimated to be on the order as much as what 10 to the -4th risk, which is real high compared to the typical health strategies of 10 to the -6. And you can see that there's some hot spots here, but you know, it's probably this is probably an underestimate, I would say, based on the newer climate models that are coming out. So they've estimated that's roughly worth about $140 billion a year in cost of life years lost. Power outages are on everybody's mind, and here in Australia, I'm sure we've already had a growing problem in the US, increasing about 2% per year, and most of that since 2005 has been due to weather. And cooling water is another one of these kind of cascading effects where all of a sudden the reservoirs and start drying up. And this happened in the 2000 heat wave in Europe too, where you know, 80,000 people died. Nuclear plants had to shut down, and the the Southwest is heavily dependent on hydro, and so is the West Coast. So we have all these cascading effects we have to start thinking about and worrying about. This was just a picture of Lake Powell back in 2014, where it was down to 50% capacity. The mussels were starting to clog the dam intakes, or thought they will soon. And then mega droughts are now projected to increase. This is not 3, but 30-year type droughts are expected to be more likely with climate change, and even more likely with increased temperatures. So we're really loading the dice a lot here. Wildfires. The quick answer is, yeah, they've gotten a lot worse. About 50% higher fire risk just in the PG&E power lines. A 3-fold increase since 2012. Big climate change impact you can see on the bottom, starting back, in the 90s, and now it's almost half of the impact and the doubling of the risk in the western states. And PG&E has said it'll take about 10 years to reduce that risk in their lines significantly in terms of upgrading the lines and clearing them and so on. Preemptive power shutoffs, we were lucky. We'd kind of dodged a bullet in terms of health. I mean, there's a lot of property damage and economic loss in these huge areas you see on the right. And then, of course, the smoke did not hit us, luckily. But in terms of power outages, they were up to 23 days, and over 3 million people were affected at a time. And if this had been during real hot or cold weather, we could have had a huge public health disaster, an emergency, with people freezing or baking to death. And air conditioning has gone up rapidly since the 30s, as you know, about from 50 to about 2,000 terawatts per hour annual use, I think. And part of that in the US has been due to migration to the southern states since the 70s. You can see this condo on the right, Miami Beach. They actually had a water pipe broken by construction accident, and they couldn't run their cooling towers. So all these elderly people were without power for several days in hot, humid climates. And then even milder climates like the Bay Area and the Northeast are now having to add air conditioning because they've seen more and more heat waves. And in Europe, the problem is even bigger. By 2050, cooling will comprise 30% of the world energy use. And on the chart on the bottom, you see most of that's from China and India, and then I think probably Asia and Southeast and Africa. And you can see the US is staying fairly flat. But who is affected by this extreme heat? These are the vulnerable populations. There's a lot of them, a lot of different types listed here. I won't go through them, but they're growing rapidly also. For example, the elderly are going to go from about 8% 2010 to 20% by 2050. Obesity, that's really high, about 36%, especially in some regional hotspots. It's even higher, like the Southeast. And hypertension is real high, 71% in the elderly. So, and many people have several of these risk factors. And so when you combine all that with the demographics, the health risks, and the climate change, we have a perfect storm for public health and housing. We have a lot of older housing, of course, that needs to be fixed. Just some more info on aging of California's populations. It's going to nearly double by 2030 and reach 8 million in California, just California. The chart on the right, you can see that increase. And there's a lot of 80 and 90-year-olds too, which are going to be very vulnerable. Also social isolation risk, such as never married, divorced, separated, or widowed and no children, and that's increasing rapidly. And then on the bottom chart, you can see there's projected to be a lot of seniors that need assistance in nursing homes, but there's going to be a big increase, almost 1 million that are going to be in their own homes that need help. So there's a huge vulnerable population there that's kind of not easy to reach. So getting to the energy and heat and health nexus, we see that some projections for mid-century from back in 2018 show that the cooling degree days are going to increase by about 1,000 cooling degree days in many of the regions. Looking at that green arrow that shows you the kind of medium orange colors. Then the blue colors, oh, and then by just by late century, it's going to be even more, about 2,000 cooling degree days in many areas. So, and this is just kind of typical. This is not even getting you through the peak heat waves and so on. The blue boxes on the map show areas where they are energy poor, they can't afford to cool or heat, and where they lack AC. And so you see that in many areas, and California has many spots like that as well. So that this suggests that even by mid-century, if not sooner, we're going to have huge impacts on the energy costs, the grid, and the grid outages and health. And just to go back to the power outages, we're now already seeing a rate increase for PG&E rates. And I don't know about other utilities, but they've already been increasing pretty steadily, but I think it's just going to go faster now. This is just a map of energy burden or poverty or inequity in the US, where you have the dilemma of, do I heat my house or do I eat? Do I cool it or do I get asthma meds for my kids? And I've heard that people are paying over $600 a month electricity bill for cooling for an older home in Redding, California, which even middle or high income people might balk at paying. And so this map shows that on the median, there's about many cities that have more than 5% of their population that are energy burdened, that they spent more than, I'm sorry, the median is, there's several cities that pay more than 5% of their income on energy utilities. So where are the people that are vulnerable? Well, some people have done a good job of that. They've looked at the hazard, who's vulnerable, and where, which buildings are vulnerable. In this case, a lot of this work has been done in the UK, and they've overlaid these maps. On the top left, they have the heat projections. In the middle, they have the vulnerability mapping for young, old, long-term illness and population requiring care. And on the right, some high-risk buildings, namely low-insulated buildings and high-rise flats in their case, and then they overlap it. And you can see that the overlapping, if you were just looking at the heat maps, it wouldn't quite show you where the high health risks are. So, so this way they can target not only their retrofit and energy programs, but their public health outreach and their emergency warning systems and everything. Not much of that has been done elsewhere, as far as I know. Most places are trying to just map, who has air conditioning, where are the seniors or other vulnerable populations. And this slide shows LA on the left and Phoenix on the right, where you have a very high percentage of dark red on the left in LA that don't have central AC, and especially low income areas near the coast. In Phoenix, it's just kind of flipped, but you do find some hot spots in the center there where it's low income and older neighborhoods where they lack central AC. Now, they may have wall AC or swamp coolers, but those generally aren't very effective in extreme heat situations. New York City, another example, they've mapped the percent of seniors without or not using AC on the left. On the right, they've mapped the mortality rate on very hot days. And you can see that they don't quite match up. So you would be misled, for example, if you looked just at the percent of seniors on the left, you see a lot of dark red, but over on the right, there's yellow. But if you look at the mortality rate on the right, you see some brown high-risk areas for mortality rate. So there's a lot of other factors going on here. Urban heat islands also can be adjusted for population density. The charts here on the top are for Fresno, on the bottom for LA. And those are being exacerbated by climate change. And you can see that when you go from A to B and you adjust for population density, you see a little different pattern there. And you find these little islands of hotspots or climate archipelagos where there's a much higher impact from the urban heat island than when you adjust it for how many people are there and how many people are being exposed. Okay, so I think we can shift back to study design for Emily.
Yeah, we can go ahead and present this section. Okay, that works too.
So I'm shifting to you.
Yeah. All right. So for our study objectives, we wanted to design a new single-family zero-net energy home in Bakersfield, California. And using this home, we wanted to examine the impacts of heat waves, future climates, and power outages with looking at overheating and energy use. And then we also had this component of optimization. We wanted to optimize our designs for these different scenarios, these either future climate or current climate, and then assess overheating and energy use as well. And then possibly in the future, optimizing for overheating risk and for carbon emissions. Our study methods, so the overheating metrics that we used to assess thermal health were the discomfort index. We'll talk more detail later. Basically, you know, we want to make the point that we should include thermal health when we're looking at, you know, optimizing buildings or, you know, what is a healthy building. Our other method is looking at TDV energy and total energy use. So TDV energy is driven by peak cooling demand here in California. And to look at this, we use the CBAC Res, which is the software for California building standards. For optimization, we also looked at TDV and cooling energy, and we used VOPT. We used VOPT, which is a free tool, and we're able to look at different measures for optimization, and Tom will talk more about that later. So the different scenarios that we looked at. So first we looked at the typical year, or the typical location, which was climate zone 13, which is one of the climate zones in California where Bakersfield is located. And then we looked at Bakersfield heat wave data, which is an historical weather file for 2006. And then for our worst case scenarios, we looked to the future climate. And for this analysis, we used analog cities, and we chose both Yuma and Phoenix for that. And then we also looked at power outages for the future climates, but also the current climates as well. So this is just a map showing the different locations. There's Bakersfield in the Central Valley, north of LA. There's the Fresno climate zone 13. Yuma was our mid-century analog, and then Phoenix was the late century analog that we chose. So how do we choose Yuma and Phoenix? First, we looked at Bakersfield in the 2050s, which is the second bar on the chart, and we used CalAdapt's tool to match up the cooling degree days and the heating degree days, and that was closely related to Yuma. And then we looked at Bakersfield in the 2090s and then matched the cooling and heating degree days, and that Phoenix matched up relatively well. In our future analysis, or another option, instead of using analog cities, you can use morphed weather files. And then I just wanted to provide some resources for people to look into later. There's a free resource online called CC World Weather Generation, and that link's there. And you can also purchase future morphed weather files through WeatherShift. Just a caveat, there's a bunch of different metrics that can be morphed to future climates, but oftentimes just temperature is morphed. So you have to be careful in, like, you know, or just make sure you know the assumptions when using the morphed weather files. So these are our metrics that we used for the overheating. Like I said before, the discomfort index and the globe temperature. Basically, I just wanted to point out that discomfort index uses the dry bulb and wet bulb, so it's looking at air temperature and relative humidity, where the wet bulb and globe temperature is using both air temperature and relative humidity, but it's also incorporating radiant temperature, and it's weighting those differently. We also kind of looked at operative temperature, but not as much, and we won't be presenting on that today. And then we're gonna do a switch back to Tom to talk about BIOP. Tom, are you there?
Yeah, I'm looking at your screen and I'm trying to get back into, not sure how to get back into it.
Well, I also want to go like, woohoo, nicely done, Emily, nicely done, Tom.
Oh, wait, there's more.
I know there's more, I know,
Slideshow.
but I figured now is a good moment because you did just finish, Emily. And like if you had just done a solo up on stage in a jazz quartet or something, like I would clap, you know.
Okay,
And,
there we go. Okay, share screen.
And I think, do we have an unannounced?
No, right now it's still Tom.
All right, here we go.
Okay, let's see. There's probably a way to do this, but we're getting there.
To review all our other slides.
Okay, let me back out let me get out of there and just do the scroll down. There we go. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good enough. Then I won't get lost in the file. So I talked about methods. I guess now, now I have to go into the methods. There we go. Yeah, what BIOP does is give you a whole menu of all these different building measure categories on the right. And so I worked on the first 9, the rest of them we left alone for the most part. And I went through category by category, looking at several options and weeded them down to 2 or 3. And the reason for that was in the end, when you try to do the full optimization, you can overload your computer. So you want to kind of pare things down up front. And so once I selected the top 2 or 3 of each of these categories, and I threw them all in the pot and then looked at what came out of it. And once you do that, you can once you've kind of optimized everything, you can then look at your site energy and size your PV system, and you can play around with optimizing the PV set design and everything too. So I think I need to go into the view. Okay, so here's just an example of the options list for slab insulation, where you can just click it and try as many as you want, and then it charts out the results in various ways depending on what metrics you're looking at. I think I've just mainly focused on different sizes and thicknesses and R values here to get a range of values. And here's an example for windows. I also tried to group together different measures that had similar effects or overlaps. So in case there were some interactions, I could find those. So for example, here I looked at windows, doors, and airflow, which is natural and mechanical ventilation and leakage, and then building orientation around the compass to see how what all the different optimum combinations were. And here's an interaction that was fairly typical, where you look at the different types of window area options, and you can also do custom options, which I think I did in this case. But in any case, you can see that there's big differences in terms of the TDV values on the bottom. You can start reducing those just by changing windows out. And there's big differences between the measures, but when you get down to the lower TDVs, you often see this crossover where all of a sudden, depending on what other measures are in the house, you get a better net result with a different window area situation. And these weren't very sophisticated. We did not look at doing window recesses into the shell like you do in a passive house. We did not look at fine-tuning the the window area on each side of the house and so on. So that's clearly the more advanced design stage. Here's another example of slab insulation where you see a crossover early on where the orange, the 4-foot R5 exterior XPS gets a better site energy consumption in this case, but probably TDV as well. And then over on the left, both the R10 and the R5 are similar, so you're just playing on the margins a little bit, or in the case of future climate, it's likely to become much more important there because every penny starts counting then. And just kind of a quick take or sense of what I saw in going through all these. I haven't quantified all of it, but the big reductions in TDV usually came from upgrading windows and window area, roof type, going to a cool roof asphalt shingles versus tile, which had to do maybe more with absorptivity. Bumping up the SEER on the HVAC, and then going from an electric standard to a heat pump water heater. And then most of the measures had kind of moderate effects on TDV. You can also look at other metrics like the total resource cost that utilities use as the net present value, CO2 emissions that we can factor in your grid emission factors. From what I could tell when I looked at CO2, it tracks TDV pretty well so far, but as we clean up our grid, that won't necessarily be so. So this is what you get when you do the full optimization. And when I was looking at energy related cost annualized dollars per year versus TDV energy, and you can see some pretty big reductions as you move to the left, and then you start to get an inflection upwards, and you get a lot of points that are maybe clustered together over in these optimums, and you can actually grab those in bunches of 3 and look at them in detail. And as a builder designer, you can then maybe pick out certain features that you like rather than another option that will get you the same net result. This is just an example of going from the Title 24 left on the left side to the right side where we've added overhangs and window shading. And this model doesn't allow you to do the side fins, but I just noticed that CBEC and a lot of design software, of course, does allow you these side fins, and that can be very effective as well. So we didn't address that. Then I did a deep dive into some of these clusters over near the optimum points on the left side of the TD curve, and zoomed in and grabbed those points and then looked at them in detail. And what I was mainly looking for was the cooling site energy. And these optimized points were all pretty similar in total and cooling energy. So I just picked one of them. And you can also, going back to this site energy charts, you can also get you can select any one of them and then see quickly which of the other columns here have different options, and you can quickly kind of filter out why there are differences and so on. And here I examined this low TDV case and downloaded the data for the chart, and you can do the calculations and compare one point to another. And looking at one of these optimum points on the left versus Title 24, I estimated that it was a 17% reduction in TDV energy. Annual energy related costs were reduced by about 120 a year. And then I looked at site energy, and we got big reductions there, which means you can downsize your mechanical systems, you can downsize your PV, you can downsize your battery and everything. And in fact, I don't have a slide here, but I wanted to mention that that's already being done by a DOE award-winning builder in Arizona, Mandalay Homes. And about a year or two ago, they started doing this by using an aero-sealed gel system to get super tight homes, and they could then downsize everything. And they got to the point where they could offer batteries as part of the normal market rate housing. And in Alabama, builders doing that now, but they also, I think, I know in Arizona, they got a subsidy from the utility to do the battery. So it's all grid connected. So the bottom line here is that you can get these big reductions in cooling, about 618 kilowatt hours per year, or 77%, versus the default kind of baseline Title 24. So that Title 24 is a very low bar, and we can really do a lot better. That's obvious finding there. Similar findings for heating. However, if you look back at the cooling degree, future projections, and so on, heating is going to be a very small part of the overall energy load by mid-century, if not sooner, for Central Valley. In hot climates, cooling will about double in terms of the cooling load. The total site energy dropped almost 1,400 kilowatt hours per year, or 16%. And the good news is that a lot of people are already trying to address thermal health in a more specific way, and not just ash-free thermal comfort standards, which nobody really enforces anyway. And I've just given some examples here. And Passive House Programs has done it for quite a while, but and I want to say it's a static, not a dynamic program, but I could be wrong. But it's basically that you have to keep the number of hours over 25C below 10% of the hours per year. But it's just a modeling exercise, so there's no verification or monitoring or anything required. And then there's a UK standard called the SIPC TM59. It's been around for several years. It's an overheating design guide. Excuse me. And they have some operative temperature requirements. If you have mechanical ventilation rate systems, it's less than 26 degrees, and for less than 3% of the occupied hours. And for natural ventilation, they have different specs where they're just looking at the occupied hours and just the cooling season, and they also look at the delta T over the course of the year, and just for the nighttime hours, I think. And then they also require you look at the 2020 weather projections, which they have in UK, and they also have a percentile distribution. And they recommend using the mid-late century projections as well under the high emission climate scenarios. So it's kind of a moderate worst case, whereas I would tend to lean more towards the reasonable worst case, and because things are generally turning out a lot worse than we expected in terms of climate change and building performance. Then lastly here, there's also the Urban Heat Island Design Guide in the UK, where they actually require this in London to do, they have zones with different urban heat island metrics and impacts, and they require you to use the design summer year weather file, which captures the more extreme heat a little better. And they require passive cooling type measures and efficiency measures before you can add mechanical cooling. So they're basically trying to delay the addition of air conditioning as long as they can. In the US or North America, there are a lot of green building type standards, like Build It Green and LEED and Collaborative for High Performance Schools, that have vulnerability climate adaptation type credits in them now over the last few years. And they're evolving rapidly. They require sometimes either a vulnerability assessment to just look at the future climate data and try to factor that into your building design, at least for the top 1 or 2 risks. And in some cases, they also include what they call a passive survivability measure, where you have to design your building to be survivable and not exceed certain temperatures for so many days of a power outage. In terms of building standards and regulatory type things, California has just updated their weather files to, I want to say 2017 or 2018, but they've also done a 10-year weather file at calmac.org, which just has the last 10 years, which have been the hottest on record, I think, in California. So using those will give you a better idea of extreme weather impacts. CalAdapt from the Energy Commission has a nice interactive tool, which includes a lot of extreme heat things like not only maximum temperatures, but now hot nights and duration of heat waves and things like that for any location in California. They're also planning to upgrade that tool and also fund some research to start getting hourly weather data around the state from a downscaled climate model, but that'll take several years. But that's kind of the gold standard if we have that kind of weather data. The PUC is also now addressing climate adaptation through all their utility programs, and that's kind of in the early stages, I think. Just wanted to show you some examples of R&D of climate adaptation and so on. Here's from Australia. They looked at low-income housing, and they didn't let's see, they were looking at the discomfort index, degree a day hours over 28, and basically when they looked at worst case, there were a lot of them over 30 hours, and I can't remember their metric there. But the bottom line was that when you went to base case, it wasn't quite so bad. And by doing a cheap retrofit, you could generally reduce it quite a bit depending on the building type. And if you went to an expensive retrofit, you could get even better. And in some cases, you know, like a H1 multifamily, you could do much better if you went to the more expensive retrofit. So they could reduce the risk from about 17 and 13% respectively for the cheap versus the expensive retrofit.
Oh, hey, Tom.
Yeah.
Could you make your slides full screen if possible? We're seeing sort of.
Yeah. Let me see.
Your whole. Thank you. And just a time check, you're about 10 minutes left.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're near the conclusion, but now I can't. I have to.
You want to switch over to results to talk about those before the conclusion?
Pardon?
We can switch back to mine and I can show the results, the CBAC results.
Oh, that's relevant.
Oh, the optimization. Yeah, let's do that because these are just examples of you know, buildings overheating and how to fix it. So I'll switch back.
Yeah, we definitely appreciate this, Emily, and thank you, Tom. Woo, Tom! I'm hoping that this work that you both have been working on for a year, something now.
On and off.
On and off, right? But I mean, that's still a significant amount of progress that we can get some better code recommendations because we're building for the future right now. So off you go. Thank you, Emily.
Yeah, so using BOP to be optimized for the current climate zone 13. And on the right column, we can see what those values were. We look specifically at windows, exterior insulation, attic insulation, slab insulation, overhangs, vented versus non-vented attics, HVAC efficiency, white roof, and exposed carpet versus 80% or 20% exposed slab. So, okay. So this is the energy use summary, and I know it's a little busy, but overall, the optimized home reduced energy, reduced the cooling load scenario, and reduce the heating load. But some of the heating load is attributed to the weather file change. Like, for example, Yuma, looking at Yuma, there's almost no heating load to begin with. But again, in the Yuma case, it reduced the cooling load by almost half. And now going into the overheating results, looking at climate zone 13, we looked at both the discomfort index and the wet bulb globe temperature again. And we looked at total hours and then total degree hours. So degree hours is per hour, the amount over each target. So it's kind of like the intensity versus just the total hour count. So looking at the baseline case to the optimized case for the discomfort index, it actually increased the overall overheating hours, but decreased the intensity of those hours. And then looking at the wet bulb globe temperature from the baseline to the optimized case, it decreased slightly the overall overheating hours and increased the degree hours or intensity. And that might be because wet bulb globe temperature is incorporating radiant heat. So looking at Bakersfield, the historical file where it was there was a heat wave during that time. Overall, the optimized home reduced the total hours and also decreased the degree hours. Looking at the discomfort index, looking at wet bulb, it's a little less of a clear trend, it did reduce the overall hours, but again, the degree hours increased a little bit. And then looking at our future climate versus the baseline home and the optimized home, both the total hours and degree hours increase for discomfort index. And then looking at the moderate temperatures, now in the UMA model, you're seeing more moderate temperatures versus just being in the mild category. The optimized home did decrease the amount of moderate hours, but the overall hours did increase. And that same trend can be observed looking at the wet bulb temperature as well. And now getting into our power outage scenarios. This is the time series of why we chose this weather file in 2006. Between July 14th and 27th, there was a heat wave. And this is showing the max temperatures of that 2006 file versus the climate zone 13 file. We can see for a few days there was sustained hot temperatures, and even at night, temperatures were above 80. So digging into these results, climate zone 13. So the overall hours were about the same, but did decrease a little bit. And instead of total hours over the entire year, this is just looking at the hours outage period. So the total hours decreased from the baseline to the optimized home, but the degree hours did increase a little bit, but with less moderate. Similar trend with wet bulb as well from discomfort index. And then this is the Bakersfield file. This is the Bakersfield model. Again, a similar trend, decreasing overall hours. So similar trend with discomfort index and the wet bulb. There was a decrease in the total hours, and then also a pretty significant, pretty significant decrease in the degree hours as well. Looking, for both indices. And this is looking for the future climate. Looking at the future climate, now you're seeing the severe hours during that outage period. The overall hours didn't really, weren't reduced that much, but the intensity of the hours were. So yeah, in summary, the first slide we looked at was energy use. So we optimized in BOP for energy use in TDV, but that's not necessarily optimizing for overheating. When we took a closer look at the overheating metrics, it kind of varied in those results. So it reduced the energy use and the cooling use, but increased the overheating in some scenarios. Comparing the discomfort index, the wet bulb global temperature, there was overall more heating hours for the WVGT, and then I'm assuming that's because of the including radiant temperature. So for the Bakersfield 2006 power outage scenario DI and WVGT were reduced in total outage hours and degree hours. And I think that's partially because when we first did the optimization, it was for Bakersfield climate zone. And then, for next steps, something ideally we would want to look into. We want to optimize for future climates. So, take Yuma or Phoenix and optimize using VOPT for those. And then looking at the discomfort index as well. We also want to look closely at the monthly and cooling season overheating results, just to get an idea of like how much or if the cooling season is increasing with the future climate files. We also want to use other weather files like morphed, like the morphed weather files I mentioned, and also CalMac provides weather files specifically for Bakersfield, looking at data, trends in the data for the last 12-ish years. And then also comparing, these results to other criteria that are out there. For example, SISB, 1% of total hours need to be under certain criteria to meet their building standard. And Passive House has an overheating metric, and it says less than 10% of total hours should be under. So, yeah, now I'm going to send it back to Tom to conclude.
Woo!
Okay, and let's see, I have to share screen, jump back in, and
Okay, you have 1 minute.
somebody asked a question about hot, dry climates and how to optimize.
Yeah.
And I'll just point them to this, and there's a lot of other work being done. I have examples I can share with you, but this is from Phoenix and Houston. Phoenix here shows on the passive survivability is the white bar, cooling is the gray bar. And you can see that by just going from, I think, new to old to new construction, higher efficiency, they could get a big improvements in the overheating prevention, the passive survivability, that is, during a power outage. And so roof absorptivity, wall insulation, and were the top two, and then the others were all important. And those probably all interact as well. And but there's people, playing with cool walls, green walls, thermal mass is, and if you can couple it with good night ventilation, maybe mechanically assisted, there's a lot of different strategies, and passive and PCM, phase change materials for thermal mass. So there's a lot of things that can be done.
Yeah, to answer that question as well, like which changes were the most effective, I did want to look at specifically measure by measure, like what the discomfort index or what those metrics were when you change step by step. So I haven't done that analysis yet. And then VOPT proved to be pretty effective in reducing the cooling load and energy use, but it's hard to incorporate the overheating metrics into VOPT. So we're kind of jumping back and forth to VOPT, using VOPT and CBEC res, because that's what I know. So I would say yes, it's effective in optimizing, but using it for looking at overheating might be a little harder.
I should also add that there's some recent research and some older research at MIT and in Europe, where there's software called Grasshopper that actually can do this kind of optimization for overheating and other things. And they've done it on some multifamily buildings. And then some newer research where they've developed what they call genetic algorithms, a new kind of statistical and techniques and whatever, and sometimes using Energy Plus, some kind of cluster of analysis where they can optimize for both overheating and energy. The other evolving question that some of these groups are addressing is when you have a moving target of cooling and heating needs, and they're changing in opposite directions over the 60 or 100-year life of the building, how do you optimize for that? And how do you stage or phase your adaptations? And so there's people developing software to do that.
With that,
So
that is the conclusion. There you go. You do your conclusions, please. Sorry about that. I just had to let you know the time is up.
Conclusion: get an infrared camera and find out where all your heat and cool leaks are. But from our analysis and from a lot of other research and demonstration out there, there's modeling and measurement tools available to do this now to mitigate overheating and energy use impacts from current climate as well as future climate. And we need to do this to keep buildings healthy and resilient or survivable and sustainable over the long term. There's some signs of progress in North America to address this problem. It's already happening somewhat in the UK and maybe Australia to address this problem. But there seems to be kind of an inflection point just in the last year or two. There's been a lot of research in mostly modeling, but now some field work, like even just north of Fresno, I just found a project where they've been monitoring low-income homes for temperature and figuring out how to prevent that. But we need to integrate this climate adaptation, these strategies and methods for extreme heat now into all programs and policies. And there's an example from England where they've done it already, a big development. And to do that, we need to routinely assess climate vulnerability to extreme heat using future weather files and design for full lifestyle optimization, not just the 30-year Title 24 timeframe. We need to include passive cooling measures first in retrofit programs as well as new construction, and target heat vulnerable populations in care facilities, schools, older buildings where you can get a lot of carbon reduction as well. And then updating our building standards design guidelines is important. We need to do it now because it takes so long to do it. And green building standards are already doing some of this, or guidelines. And to make that happen, we need to educate, integrate, and train all the building and planning and health professionals and factor this thermal health and other health aspects into every phase and do it at the beginning, not at the end. And then accelerate market demand through improved financing incentives, demonstrations, and marketing for future-proof buildings. So I would encourage anybody to try to network and keep their eyes open for opportunities for any kind of landmark type project or a client that's really interested in being super sustainable or leading edge, or in case of, say, government buildings where there's long-term investment, and there's some great opportunities, I think, that are out there where we can start actually implementing these kinds of approaches.
Hey, Tom.
So thank you very much. Be prepared for extreme, adapt or mitigate now or die.
All right. Thank you very much.